The impact of imperialism was so great that we literally today are still dealing with it. Areas in Africa and Southeast Asia still have not recovered. You can see on this map that there were European colonies all over the world. Some of the short-term effects were that Asians and Africans came under foreign rule, and they never really had a chance to see what they could truly do. Local economies became dependent on industrial powers, and they never learned how to survive in the industrial world without help, without a big brother telling them what to do. Political units were destroyed. The tribes were disrupted. There was no more traditional, family-run governments. It was all based on, the European powers telling the locals what they will do. Famines occurred in lands where farmers grew export crops for imperialistic nations in place of food for local use. And this was really, really bad. They would have them grow, tobacco, cotton, sugar, things that you really can't eat as a food source. And because of this, as you know, many areas in Africa are not the greatest for farming, and so the African people would literally starve to death. And that picture on the slide you can see is a very gruesome reminder of that. Some of the long-term events was that the West discovered new crops, which was very important, and Westerners also were introduced to new cultural influences. Competition for empires created and increased a lot of conflict between the imperial powers, and this sometimes led to war. One of these big wars will be World War I and eventually World War II. Industrial nations controlled the new global economy. If you were not England, France, United States to a point, Japan, Russia, then you weren't part of the game, because they made all the rules, they made all the choices, they made all the prices, and you basically had to do what they told you to do. And they made sure that the rules of the game were not fair, and they always came out the winner. In Egypt, they basically built the Suez Canal between the French and the British. They carved right through Egypt and made a water area between the Mediterranean Sea, going through the Red Sea as a shortcut to get to India. They no longer had to go all the way down the tip of Africa. They could basically cut through the Middle East. And that canal today is a huge moneymaker for Egypt. It's their, one of their #1 ways to make money for the national economy. And it's a very, very important world waterway. Important strategic locations for Britain and other imperialistic nations because it allowed for faster movement, and a lot of people is going to fight for this area. There's going to be wars over the Suez Canal, who controls the Suez Canal, and there's going to be wars throughout the whole Middle East. We're still dealing with that today because it is a hot trading area. In India, Britain had many effects. They did some good stuff. They provided irrigation systems for farming. They also brought in telephone line. They brought in trolley lines. They built railway systems. Those were all, improved the postal system. These were all good, positive things for the Indian people. Unfortunately, they also basically all the resources of India went to Great Britain, and that was not a good thing. And the farmers were forced to grow cash crops instead of food crops, which many of the Indians went hungry because of this. Cash crops are, to remind you, are crops that you grow for the money. They're not always food crops. Think tobacco, cotton, opium, but they're crops that make you a lot of money, but you can't necessarily eat them. They also, like I said, built roads and railways, the telegraph, the postal system, and here's a picture of an Indian railway, and this is not that old. Believe it or not, the railways still look like this. If you take the train to India, you literally still, in some areas, ride like this. Again, bad effects. British-made goods replaced local goods, and they would jack up the prices of the British-made goods so that the British would make even more profits off the Indian people. They created new laws, so there was justice for everyone. It didn't matter what class you were in. If you remember, they had the caste system in India, so everyone was a different level in the social system. The British got rid of that and said, no, everyone's the same under the law. They allowed for British education, and they ended customs that threatened human rights. There was one, sati, which is when the Indian woman, when her husband dies, she must throw herself upon his funeral pile, or basically the fire that he's getting cremated in. She must also die with her husband. And the British ended this custom and said, no, the wives can live on if their husbands have died. Some of the bad effects were the top jobs always went to the British. The Indians were always treated as inferior. They were not worthy. And the Great Britain tried to replace Indian culture with Western ways, and that did not go over well. And all of basically China, Africa, and India guys suffered under control when they were under control of the European powers, because the European powers were there to make the money. They were not there to help the people. And so if you remember anything, just remember that imperialism is based on we want more money and we want more land, because land equals money. It's all about the money and power.